Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Krause, I just want to make sure, you stated that the GAO does not know how much is collected through the fees and fines and all that sort of thing. Is that correct?
There are data out there about individual ones. It has not been aggregated into a total. It's a very involved, complex process in terms of understanding the underlying specific legal authorities associated with those funds.
Well, in the first place, it seems like that would be information that not only you should have, but you would want to have. But secondly, this bill would correct that problem as well if we're able to move forward. And Mr. Hollister, right along these same line, I want to just, for clarification, I want to make sure that you you testified a while ago that the Treasury can provide an accurate number for the fees, fines, and settlements. Is that correct?
Mr. Hice, yes, my understanding is the Treasury can. The information that the Treasury receives from agencies is often in the form of summaries, so Treasury might give you amounts, but Treasury might not be able to walk that back all the way to the specific complexities of the legal authority under which each bunch was collected. Treasury, however, could give us, from the Central Accounting Reporting System, could give us aggregations. And my testimony was that Congress could direct Treasury to include that in the overall spending structure.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think it'd be wise for us to request that number from the Treasury, just to have an idea of what we're dealing with here. Mr. Kosar, let me ask you, regarding the fines and fees, penalties, settlements, all this sort of stuff, do you have any idea how much that has increased over recent years?
No, I do not.
Who would have that information for us? Does anyone chart the increase of fees, fines, and settlements?
I would think OMB would have a number to use, and then presumably we could get some better data from Treasury.
I would also like for us to get that information if we can. And let's just for the sake of being in here, is it fair, do you think, to make the assumption that fees and penalties, fines have increased over the years? Is that a fair assumption?
I would say so, and I would say so probably as a proportion of the budget it has increased.
Right. I would say so as well, because we're now watching some agencies actually live off of those things. And so with the assumption that it is more than likely accurate that the fines, penalties, fees have increased, how does that, number one, enable these agencies to operate independently, but also how does that impact Congress's role?
Well, Mr. Hice, it reminds me of Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Treasury Secretary complaining that the spending, even at that time in 1802, the federal government's operations had gone beyond the comprehension of Congress. The complexity at that point had already grown to the point where Congress couldn't comprehend it. And in this case, we see, because Congress has, over the last 200 years, delegated authority in very complex ways to agencies, we have a great deal of difficulty in getting that comprehension. I think we could start to regain it by consistently tracking that information and asking for that information to be put into the whole picture, integrated into the whole picture.
Well, I would absolutely agree, and it seems to me with the complexity that you mentioned, the more complex this whole scenario is, the more difficult it is to have oversight over it, and it gets out of hand rapidly, and it seems, and that, you know, this whole thing, and I just pick up on what Mr. DeSantis said, you know, this ultimately comes down to a constitutional issue, and fair enough, Congress over the decades has yielded some authority to these agencies, but we are on the verge of a genuine constitutional crisis now where those who are representatives are not having oversight and accountability because those who are unelected in very powerful agencies are now able to operate independent from Congress and do multiple things. They're not even elected by the people. And all of this creates a potential enormous constitutional crisis. Would you agree with that, Mr. Kosar?
I would say it creates basic questions of legitimacy and concerns along that line, and it also leads, I think, to the perspective that, you know, where's the real power lie? Which branch eyes more and more turn to the executive branch? I mean, each time in an authorization say, you allow an agency to collect fees for a particular purpose and spend them for a particular purpose, then, okay, you're directing the congressional spending, but because it's put into an authorization statute, if that agency misuses the money or has too much of it, well, you're going to have to pass another law to get that back. And as we know, in this environment, passing legislation is very difficult. So the more of it that is kind of toggled in one direction, the more toggles you got to pull back if things don't work out right.
Well, I thank the panelists, and I thank my colleague from Alabama for this bill, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence. I yield back.